Good afternoon, and welcome to today's edition of Black Health Trust. We're so happy that you chose to spend this time with us, and we're looking forward to a very informative discussion this afternoon with our speaker. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our founder, Dr. Randall Maxey.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Stevens. I've known you a long time. I keep forgetting to add the Stevens part to your name. I don't know why. But I've also known my other co-moderator, Dr. Ivan Walks, who's a world-class psychiatrist. And on every other Sunday, we also have Dr. Jocelyn Hines join us. I think she was here last week.
Yeah.
We do have an exciting program today, and we have a young lady who happens to be both a PhD in psychology. She also has a master's in divinity, and her title, therefore, is Reverend Dr. Sherry Moloch. And she is a founding pastor of a church located in Maryland. So Sherry Davis Moloch is a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Moloch teaches undergrads and at the doctoral level in clinical psychology and conducts research on the prevention of suicide. She also opines on HIV in African American youth, and her work has appeared in a number of professional journals throughout the country. She also sits on a scientific workshop and served as an advisor to Congressional Black Caucus and Emergency Task Force on Suicide Prevention in Black Youth. The most important thing to me, she is the founding pastor, along with her husband, of a church located in Maryland. And I told her that I'm a PK as well, and I think both Ivan and Barbara are PKs as well. So you're well at home, Dr. Moloch. We appreciate you being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And to all the PKs in the audience, we're sorry. No, I am not a PK, but my three children are PKs. And so we're going to talk today a little bit about suicide prevention with African American youth and doing these prevention programs within the context of the church. So am I good to share my slides?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. And can you all see those?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a program called Haven Connect, which is a suicide prevention program that was designed specifically for African American youth in the context of Black churches. And the title of the talk is Bridge Over Troubled Waters. So whenever I do a talk, I like to talk about the context that I bring to this work. I think a lot of times we only talk about our professional context, but I'm a daughter. My father is 98 years old and just recently moved in with us and is in good health. I've been married for 38 years to the love of my life and also the co-founding pastor of our church. I'm a preacher. I'm a mother of young adult children. I'm a grandmother. I'm a dog lover. I do work in suicide prevention and HIV. I like to needlepoint. I like Korean dramas. Thai is my favorite cuisine. And I do Zumba and other things for fitness. And so I think it's important for us to remember that we don't do things in a silo and that we bring all of who we are to this work and to this endeavor. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, my co-laborers in this for the program that I'm going to be talking about, which is Haven. My colleagues are Dr. Sydney Hankerson, who's a psychiatrist at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City, and Dr. Peter Wyman, who is a psychologist at the University of Chartres School of Medicine. And together we developed this program called Haven. I also want to acknowledge funders. I think sometimes funders are our unsung heroes. And so Dr. Jay Carruthers, who is Director of the Suicide Prevention Center of New York for the state of New York, gave us the seed money to develop this program. And then we also received funding from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to do this prevention program over 3 years in New York State. So these are also people who have participated. These are youth participants, facilitators, and other colleagues of mine who have also been doing this work. We've been doing this for about a year now. We have 2 more years to go in terms of our funding. So what is Haven Connect? Haven Connect, Haven stands for Helping Alleviate Valley Experiences Now. It's a comprehensive depression and suicide prevention program for youth that's designed to be integrated in predominantly Black Christian churches. It has 3 components: the church engagement, a faith-based curriculum, which I'll talk about more in detail, which includes embedding suicide prevention strategies within sermons, Bible studies, and/or Sunday school. And then there's a suicide prevention specifically designed for youth. Haven began, I actually developed the Haven model in 2008, and it was published in a journal at that time. Could not get funding for it. And then out of the blue, Jay Carruthers called me and asked me, did I have data on the program? And I told him no. And he volunteered to give us seed money to get it started. So, he's not comfortable with this, but I always tell him that was the spirit moving for him to just call out of the blue like that. Mm-hmm. So why Haven Connect? I'm sure most of you know this, but suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 through 19. But what's very alarming is in the Black community, the rates of suicide for young Black kids has been increasing more exponentially than any other racial ethnic group in the United States. So the suicide attempts rates rose 73% between 1991 2007 for Black adolescent boys and girls. Injury by attempt rose for adolescent boys during that same period of time, 122%. More recently, in the 10 to 24 age group, suicide rates were highest among American Indian, Alaskan Native populations, but the greatest increase, again, was seen for those youth who are Black. And we also know that for the first time in 2015, the suicide rates, these are deaths, for Black children between the ages of 5 to 12 were approximately double that for white children of similar age groups. So why did we decide to develop Haven Connect in the Black church? Obviously, I'm a pastor, so I think it's an important venue. But even before I was even in ministry, I was thinking about doing this because the Black church is an excellent venue for promoting positive mental health. It continues to be one of the most influential institutions within the Black community. Black people are more likely to be affiliated with the church, and that includes youth. And over 60% of Black youth attend church regularly. There has been a decline in church membership across racial ethnic groups, particularly since COVID. And I don't know if you're experiencing that in your own churches, but particularly we've seen a decline in youth participation, primarily because I think a lot of churches are not at full capacity since COVID, and most youth ministries are very activity driven. And obviously when we were during COVID, we had to be isolated and sequestered. So I think that those ministries, youth ministries, are just kind of getting back on board. But even having said that, Black churches still have a higher retention rate than any other racial ethnic group. Most Blacks attend church in predominantly Black congregations, are more likely to attend religious services, say that religion is important in their lives, and more likely to say that they believe in God. We also thought it was important to develop this intervention within a faith community because mental health issues also affect people across faith traditions. Faith leaders and faith communities are often first responders. So I know that as a psychologist, I have more access to people and people are more open to talking to me about problems in the church context than they are with setting up a clinical appointment with me. Faith communities care for the whole person. So it's really important to remember that what's different from a mental health professional, a traditional mental health professional, and the clergy is that we see whole persons, but we also see them in multiple contexts within the community and within their families. So you have a better sense of how they're functioning as a whole person in different contexts. There are also mental health professionals who might be in the actual faith community or attending services. And some of you talked about going to church. Dr. Walker, I believe you talked about going to church earlier today. So we have people like you in the churches themselves, and something that we often minimize, but mental health crisis can also be crises of faith. Why the Black church? The two things that I think, it's not the only things that they do, but in terms of protective factors for mental health challenges, the church is very good at fostering social connectedness, a sense of belonging, and really importantly, there's a concept called mattering. Mattering is when you feel that you make a difference in the lives of others. People don't just notice your presence, but also notice when you're not there. And people go and see about you. They find you, they call you, they go visit with you. People care about what you think, they care about what you say. In the church, we know that we're very good at celebrating when these things are going well for you, but we're also really good at giving you a shoulder to cry on when things are not going well with you. So we're willing to celebrate, but also lament with you, letting people know that they appreciate you. And so particularly for African Americans, the church might be the only place that you feel you do matter. And so that's a really important resource. So our program is a universal prevention program. It is not designed for people who are in crisis, although people who are in crisis can participate in the program. But we really want to take a more upstream approach to this so that if you see this bridge over waters, which is why the title is Bridge Over Troubled Waters, we want to help intervene with mental health challenges before people fall into the stream. And most of our care is at the tertiary level, where we wait for people to be in crisis, and then we try to have prevention strategies. But a much more cost-effective, efficient way of doing this is to catch people before they are in crisis and providing them with a bridge so that they don't ever get into crisis at all. So we're trying to figure out how could we do that, and that's how we developed the Haven Connect program. As I said earlier, there's 3 components. There's the church engagement, faith-based curriculum, and the Youth Connect. I'm actually going to talk about the faith-based curriculum first because it's easier to understand the context of the church engagement if we talk about that first. So, faith-based component provides an educational overview for pastors and youth leaders on mental health education or mental health literacy. We talk to them about the protective and risk factors associated with suicide and the 4 cores for the actual intervention itself, which is called Youth Connect, kinship, guidance, purpose, and balance. And I'll talk about those in detail in a minute. And then we really work with pastors on how to integrate mental health knowledge, mental health literacy into sermons, Bible study lessons, Sunday school lessons, and youth programs. We really feel it's very important that this information be embodied in a sermon. The sermon is sort of the way that we can capture the norms and the values and what's important to the church. It's also a way for the pastors to give people, quote unquote, permission to go ahead and to engage in help-seeking behaviors and, if necessary, use mental health resources. So the whole program itself kicks off with the sermon. And in addition to that, this information can also be incorporated into Bible study lessons, Sunday school lessons, and youth programs. This is just some examples from my own church, the Beloved Community Church. So every week during COVID, we had a physician, a neonatologist from Georgetown, who's also on the ministerial staff at our church. And she did a segment, she still does it, called Is There a Doctor in the House? And so she updated us with COVID updates. As you all know, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of misinformation and a lot of confusing information that particularly came from the White House. And she was a trusted voice in our community that would tell us, the things that was scientifically backed or based and the things that were not. We literally had a chain of how to get the vaccine. Initially, it was very challenging. And so we actually had a chain of people calling each other and texting and emailing. That's actually how I got my vaccine, of what sites were available. And so we had 100% vaccination rates in our church because of this. And we've done this around other health challenges as well. So it worked really beautifully. We've done workshops about suicide prevention and depression. This is an example of the members of our church at a workshop. And I've also presented, there's a national conference that's done in Tennessee every other year in Memphis. It's the National Black Church Conference. It's 20 years old now, and it's done biannually. So there are barriers to mental health care in faith communities. There are challenges about viewing mental illness as a sin or moral failing. that suicide is a reflection of lack of faith or weak faith. I often still hear, unfortunately, that suicide is a white thing, that Black people don't attempt suicide or don't die by suicide. And we know that there's stigma associated with mental illness. And there's also a belief in some communities that suicide is an unpardonable sin. So we address all of these barriers in the program itself. And we actually have the pastors address these issues in the sermon that they develop. Okay, our second component is the Youth Connect, the actual intervention itself. It's adapted from an intervention, a suicide intervention called Sources of Strength, which is a universal best practices youth suicide prevention program, which focuses on a strength-based approach. So a lot of times when we do intervention programs, there's a focus on the challenges that people have and the risk factors. While it's important to identify risk factors, it's also important to really highlight protective factors and highlight community strengths. I think this is particularly important in the Black community where there's a tendency to only focus on pathology. So we talk a lot about increasing social bonds, school engagement, reducing maladaptive coping, and increasing the referral of suicidal teens to adults for help. So Youth Connect training focuses on strengthening skills and growing 4 cores or protective factors. Kinship or healthy bonds, not just with your family, but also with fictive kin or family that we create by choice. I know we all know in the Black community, we got millions of cousins and millions of aunties and uncles. My children do too. And so we really foster and promote young people having access to those kinship bonds and relying on those, particularly during challenging times. We also talk to them about the concept of guidance, which is support from mentors, which can be medical and mental health expertise, but also to tell them that they themselves can be a mentor, so they're not just receiving help, but they're also giving help to others. That it's important to have a sense of purpose. I think because of the kids in our program are 13 to 19 years old, and many of them are in high school, one of the most valuable components of this program is letting them know that sometimes you don't know what your goals are, you're not really clear on your purpose, and that it's an ongoing, ever-evolving, ever-changing journey. And so it's okay if you don't know exactly what your goals are, and it's okay if you don't know exactly what your sense of purpose are. The other thing that a sense of purpose we really promote is having a sense of belonging, which I talked about earlier. Sometimes kids may not feel like they fit in at their school environment, but the church is a place where they can not only fit in, but you can fit in without being judged. The church is one of the few institutions where there's no evaluation. So yes, these programs can be done in school settings, but what's different about the church is that sense of belongingness and that lack of evaluation. There are no grades associated with this. You don't have to worry about someone judging you based on your abilities. And then last but not least, we talk about balance, the importance of having self-care and support throughout your day. So the youth participate in 3 90-minute, highly interactive modules that have specific learning objectives around those 4 goals. We elicit personal goals and reasons for engaging in the group. We introduce the 4 cores as protective factors that promote resilience. We discuss ways to balance and strengthen the cores. And we also really have a lot of focus on how can you take those 4 cores and extend that learning into your natural environment. And what's really been wonderful when we've done exit interviews on these and we do follow-ups is how the young people incorporate this into their daily lives. And so some of the young people have taken this into groups that they already belong to. One of the young people talked about her chess club and how she took the 4 cores of concepts to them and has other people now. So this is very easily transmuted and disseminated in other settings, and young people are often very involved in doing that. We also give them post-training motivational text messages that promote the 4 cores and talk up to them and reminding them to make sure that they incorporate those into their daily living. We have small group leaders who are recruited directly from the churches who actually run the program. They receive a total of 10.5 hours of training to help them run small breakout groups. We also have other adults who have a 2-hour mini version. These are not the adults who are going to actually run the program, but They are adults who might work with you, that might just be interested in learning more about the program. We also have a number of parents. We actually so far in the churches, we have just as many adults doing this training as we have young people. And in a couple of cases, we had more adults doing this than we had young people in the church doing it. The churches can also opt to do a Bible study. So one of the beautiful things about Haven Connect is very flexible. So everyone has to do the sermon, but after that, whether or not they do a Bible study or Sunday school or a series is up to the pastor of the church. So it's very flexible. One of the pastors in our pilot study did a kickoff sermon, and then he did podcasts for not just the high school students, but also for students who were in college, who were members of the church but were away at school. I've done it in my own church as a series at the beginning of the year. We have a 4-part series where each service we focus on a core. You can do it that way. And you can also do key informant interviews. So we look at the experience that people have had with this program. Church engagement. So we start, before we do the faith-based curriculum, I meet with the pastor, the senior pastor of the church, for about 90 minutes to 2 hours. We talk about the program, and then they actually have a training from me on the faith-based curriculum. And the faith-based curriculum talks about suicide statistics. It talks about the 4 cores. It also talks about where suicide appears in the Christian text in the Bible. It lists up, there are 6 scriptures that are involved with that. We talk about some theology behind suicide being an unpardonable sin and where that comes from. And actually, by the way, that's not in the Bible. So we talk about where that came from. And this curriculum, which is 2 hours long, is a condensed form of a course I taught at Howard University School of Divinity, their seminary there, on the Black Church and Depression. And so it's condensed from that semester-long course. We have at least 2 of our staff do the actual training, and they're responsible for training the church members on how to do the Haven Connect program with the youth. We also have what's called the church champion. That's the person who's the primary liaison between the program and the church itself. That person is very critical, and we don't move forward until we have that person identified. And then, as I said earlier, we have the small group facilitators. So we have lots and lots of meetings. The church champion or the sojourners connect us to local churches. If the church expressed an interest, then we proceed with scheduling the trainings, scheduling the sermon, the faith-based curriculum, and then the key informant interviews. So far, we had 4 churches involved in the pilot, 3 churches in the pilot study, and we are on our we've just finished our 2nd cohort of churches in the actual program itself. We do 2 churches at a time. They are matched, and 1 church gets the intervention, and then 1 church is on a 6-month waiting list. So it's a wait list design. And then once that 2nd church, it's randomized. And so once that 2nd church is involved in the testing of the program, then each of them we do a follow-up for 1 month, and then 3 months, and then 6 months. So these are some of our community partners in the pilot study. This is First Corinthian Baptist Church, which is a huge church in Harlem. And their pastor is Reverend Dr. Michael Walren. Dr. Lena Green was our church liaison, and she's the executive director of the Hope Center, which is a non-profit that's affiliated with the church. They were wonderful. This is a very well-resourced church. We had to prepare very few flyers, et cetera, for them. They are a well-oiled machine. So this is one example of a church that can do this. We actually still partner with this church, and we've been doing a lot of follow-up with them. This is the one church we went in and did it again. We did the program twice. This is another community partner in Rochester, First Genesis Missionary Baptist Church, with Reverend Frederick Johnson Sr. There's the pastor. And this is our community partner in Macedonian Baptist Church, Reverend Michael Poindexter. He's also a licensed social worker. And we are also still in touch with this church and talking about specifically, we just got a little bit of seed money to do the sustainability study in this church. And this is also the pastor that did the podcast. So these are just some resources that are available. Psychology of Hope, A Biblical Response to Tragedy and Suicide. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has an entire program called Soul Shop for Black Churches, which is a suicide prevention for the entire congregation, not just aimed at youth. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center also has faith communities and has slides and information for churches. And the National Action Alliance Faith-Based Task Force, which I was a member of. Every May, they have a weekend called May of Faith, Hope, Life. It was a weekend of prayer that's designed specifically for suicide prevention. So I thank you for your time. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I appreciated it from a lot of different standpoints, but let me ask you a beginning question.
Okay.
And can you clearly state that the deeper your faith and involvement in a faith process lessens your exposure to self-immolation or suicide?
That's a really important and great question, and it plagues us a lot. There's no research that suggests that because you are embedded in a faith tradition that you won't experience depression. What the research does suggest is that you're less likely to attempt to take your life. And the major reason for that is this twofold. One is because of what I talked about earlier, that sense of belongingness and that sense of mattering is a protective factor. Also, this is the part that's more debatable, is whether or not the prohibitions against suicide, and particularly in churches, is helpful or not. One school of thought is that it's not as helpful because when people are struggling, they can't come forth and talk about it in the church because of the stigma associated with it. Other people argue that because having a prohibition against suicide in the church is helpful because there's no social norms that will promote or sanction that. I tend to fall on the side of, I think it's really important to what I call leave the light on, which is to have an open policy for people to discuss their issues and concerns. And when we highlight or focus on suicide as unpardonable sin, it just people who need help don't come to church to get help.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stevens.
Thank you so much for this very timely conversation. I didn't share with you before, but I am a pediatrician, and mental health issues in children right now is the really, really hot topic.
Right.
So from that perspective, I would like to ask you, based on your experience and analysis of your data to date, what would you identify as the three most dominant, I started to say the worst, but the three most dominant trends that you've identified among children that are at least entertaining the idea of suicide or are at risk for that?
Great question. So I think one is mental health. I'll just put it in a broader context of mental health challenges, particularly depression and anxiety. So I think young people are really experiencing heightened anxiety and depression. I think some of that is the world that they live in now. I think one of the things that my students and I are starting to study more of formally is looking at the impact of racial discrimination, but also racial messaging that young people are exposed to. Our doctoral students are looking at this specifically around social media, which surprisingly, there's very little research on that. Even though we know young people spend a lot of their time on social media, there aren't a lot of good studies that look at their exposure to racism and discrimination on social media. So I think that's one issue. I think another issue is that, bullying, the relationship between bullying and suicide and depression is complicated because people who bully also sometimes perpetrate bullying. So we know that kids who are bullied are also more likely, have a heightened likelihood of themselves being bullies as well. So I think that relationship, but trying to find a safe space where young people can feel affirmed is harder and harder, I think. And I think the other area that we really need to look at is where are the spaces that young people can feel affirmed and protected. And sometimes those spaces are hard to identify for them.
Well,
I
thank you.
think COVID sort of exacerbated all those problems.
Dr. Ivan Wilkes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Maxey. I would like to defer my question to a senior psychiatrist. Dr. Lawson has joined us, and I'm happy to speak after Dr. Lawson. And Dr. Lawson invited Dr. Josu, I think is how I would say your name. And so maybe we can have Dr. Josu ask a question and then correct my pronunciation, please. And then I'm happy to jump in after those two doctors.
So welcome,
Dr.
Dr. Lawson. I know that Dr. Moloch was referred with high honors by you, so she lived up to exactly what you said.
Hello, Dr. Lawson. It's nice to see you.
Hi, good to see you. I just verified it with fellow faculty again to the sign my letter.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to note that one of the things, as you know, one of the other things that's happened recently is, of course, this high rate of overdose deaths related to opiates. And one of the questions that some of us have tried to figure out is how much of that is really suicide versus incidental consequences of use?
That's an excellent question. This is one of my, and you and I have talked about this before. So
Yeah.
right now, the way these suicidal attempts and deaths are defined are I think, are very narrow and not necessarily conducive, particularly to Black people. So I think the difficulty in trying to figure out, are these deaths accidental or suicide, is that by definition, suicide, there has to be a deliberate attempt to end one's life. That has to be the goal. And the goal has to be immediate. And we can argue about how do you define or operationalize immediacy. But the problem with that definition, though, is that we all know as mental health professionals that there are people who will die slower, but they may not in that moment have an intent to die, but they also are hopeless and have a sense of fatalism. Those deaths right now are not counted as suicides. But we also know that Black youth have the most misclassified numbers of suicides than any other racial ethnic group. And part of that is because they're more likely to die in ways that are classified as accidents, which includes not just substance use, but also includes, for example, drownings, stabbings, falling from buildings, where it's more challenging to clearly state if the intent at that moment was to die. If you can't prove intent, then those deaths will either be classified as accidents or they will be classified as questionable deaths. So you don't know. So the suicide rates are probably underestimated in our community.
Dr. Wilkes?
Dr. Joseph,
Hi, thank you guys. Can you hear me? Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
could you speak up a little bit, sir, or move a little
Can you hear
closer to the microphone?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, Dr. Lawson. He probably doesn't remember. So I am Dr. Josue, and I am a graduate of Morehouse School of Medicine. And my background is in neuropsychiatry. So I practice holistic medicine, and 90% of my patients are Black people. I'm practiced currently in PG County in Maryland.
Oh,
So,
yay.
So one thing that I've converted myself into basically holistic medicine because I realized I'm from the Caribbean originally. The human brain is not adapting well to the current environment, and we have to address the biological effect of the brain natural stress response. So I see, as a neuropsychiatrist, I see people from 6 and up, and I do mostly holistic medicine, combine spiritual, mind, body, brain approach. And that's what I'm doing in the Black community. I think that's, thank you for all the work that you guys have been doing. You guys are pioneers. Dr. Lawson, I've met him, he doesn't know, but I appreciate, we appreciate what you guys have been doing. But the new environment is screaming for approaching a different way. Hopelessness and helplessness among Black society, the Black youth, has increased. It has to do with the new environment. And I am big on when people come to my office, children, let them know, one, the brain natural stress response. And most people don't know that 90% of our behaviors and habits are formed unconsciously. So therefore, I tell them, when we put our brain, what we watch, what we see, what we touch, we have to let people know that, because the youth, exposure to all kind of things. So I came from Shepherd Pratt. My mentor is from Hopkins. I became tired of giving people medications and it's not doing much for them. Of course, medication is important. So I realized I had to do an integrative approach. So that's my thank you again for allowing me. But that's I've been my approach, and I'd like to collaborate with with and Miss Dr. Muller to see that we're getting the new tools in the 21st century. That's what's going on. But
Thank you for
yeah.
thank you for your comment. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So now that I've let all of the expert psychiatrists go, I'll jump in. Dr. Mahler, first of all, thank you for a tremendous presentation. Dr. Joshua, hopefully I'm doing a better job of pronouncing your name. I'm also of Caribbean descent. I was born in Guyana in South America, long time ago. Got my accent beaten out of me in South Central LA, so I sound more like a regular American. But I practice in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland. Know Dr. Lawson very well. I think I've known him too long. I've eaten too many meals at your house, Dr. Lawson. But let me first of all say a couple of things. What I've heard this afternoon, Dr. Mahler, is very well organized and one of the many needed answers to, yeah, there's a problem. What do we do? And I think that so many times we get into this celebrating the problem and talking about the trends, and having such a well thought through, organized, and resourced approach is just tremendous. And we need more of those approaches. And we need approaches. One of the comments that Dr. Joshua had put into the chat earlier was a comment referencing this concern about faith and science and the integration of. And I think there's the Black community, and then there's no such thing as the Black community unless you put an IES on it, because we have so many different kinds of communities and we have so many different kinds of backgrounds. And early on, we were talking about me going to church this morning. Yes, I do. Yes, it's important to me and I love it. And two quick things about church. One is that I had the honor of being invited to go to the Vatican years ago to meet with the Pope to talk about this thing that people don't feel that you can go for mental health treatment because you ought to just go pray. You need to talk to your priest, talk to your pastor, talk to your imam, talk to your whatever. And the Pope issued a papal edict that's basically said, in a lot of words on a lot of pages, basically said, it's okay to go see your shrink. And I think that we need to have people who are able to walk across that bridge between faith and science and finding a link. And I think the other thing is, for me, one of the most important hallmarks of my career early on was when I saw a senior pastor who came to me and struggled with coming to see a psychiatrist and said to me words I'll never forget. He said, God doesn't waste anything. So if God made psychiatrists, there must be a use for you. And I said to him, I said, Pastor, I'll take it. And we did some good work together. So I think it's important for us to not feel that whatever approach we take is the only approach. I work with pastors and other docs across. Dr. Lawson also has been involved with some projects we've done with the Leadership Council for Healthy Communities, which is a linking together of physicians and pastors across the DC and Maryland region, so that we can not make anybody feel like what we do on the mental health side is not relevant for them. So I would love to have everyone that is a mental health person. And I was on the faculty at GW back when Skip Wilson was the provost, and really enjoyed that. I've been on the Howard faculty, all of that, because I think that we have to be able to reach out across disciplines. And if everyone, Dr. Malik, came at it with the kind of organized scientific approach that you come at it with, none of that was good grammar, but you understood what I was saying.
You were
really
speaking
need-
ebonically, I understand.
All right, sister, I got you. So there's something very important, Pastor Malik, about us being able to take how we are gifted to help and put it in a way that those who need the help can take it. So my question for you is, as you're looking, there was a question in there, Dr. Maxey. I know you're going to text me later and say, did you have a question? So
Yep.
the question I have is, how are you working to reach those churches that are going to be on that 6-month wait list for the next opportunity?
Great question. So first of all, thank you for your comments too. I completely agree with you. I think one of the frustrating things in this work initially was people saying to me that you could not bring the mental health and the church community together.
Right.
And one, for those of us who are Christians, Jesus is called the mighty counselor. And the way the Greek word for that is not lawyer, it's counselor, like counseling. and so I would say it's not true to the text. And there's so many examples of where God uses people to help people in crisis. We also know that most of the major prophets probably had major depressive disorder. And I've done so many sermons on Moses. My church members jokingly say Moses had chronic depression. I go, yeah, because we talk about him so much in this context. So I think that's really important. Now back to your question, I think, and I think Dr. Joe Swaits talked a little bit about this too, and Dr. Lawson. The need right now for mental health treatment, intervention, support for young people is so high that we almost have a waiting list of churches to get in this program. We have not met any resistance so far. Now, where we might disagree is there's a component of the program that talks about intersectional identities, and we talk about the LGBTQ youth, which we have even higher risk. So some churches are more uncomfortable addressing that issue. Our job is to provide the information and to share with churches that you need to decide, given your congregation, what information you do and don't share. But are we going to skip that information? No, because I think that's irresponsible to do that. So that's one thing. We also have churches who, I'll be honest with you, do struggle with this issue. I'm just even talking about suicide and depression. And that's where the role of the pastor comes in, is saying you set the tone for your church, and you have the power to change in a very powerful way social norms about this discussion. So you can take baby steps in doing this, which some do, and then some churches like the church in Harlem, they have an entire center developed around mental health in young people. Okay. So they're way ahead. Their bar is much higher, and it's we're just kind of providing them with guideposts, really, as opposed to the church in Albany, we're working with more closely. They were one of the churches that was struggling with, people feel uncomfortable with us. And so their sermon, which was so powerful, was titled Courageous Conversations. And that's the metaphor they used to introduce this topic to the church. And they probably are not further along, but have made the biggest change of the churches that we've worked with. They're the church that we're looking at the sustainability in. And so, because they refuse, even though it's uncomfortable and it's hard, and we say, again, you don't go faster than the congregation can go. Now, this is true anyway. So I think if you're pastoring a church, you can't go faster than the congregation can go anyway. So our job is to provide you with the information. How you use the information is up to you. If your church can't have an open conversation about LGBTQ youth, you don't have to. But do we give you the information? Yes. Same thing with, yeah.
I have a question that's sort of basic. We've got all these mental health professionals, but I got a very basic. What does the term suicidal ideation versus attempted suicide? Can you clear that up for me?
Yeah, so suicidal ideation is suicidal thoughts they can be very fleeting and vague. Sometimes kids, if you ask them, are you thinking about harming yourself or killing yourself? They'll say, no, I mean, I think about dying, but they don't have a specific plan. A suicide attempt is when there's a deliberate attempt to engage in self-harming behavior where the intent is to harm oneself or kill oneself. And so that's the definition I probably have the most trouble with, because I think it doesn't necessarily cover all the perspectives or the behaviors in our community. I think that gets back to Dr. Lawson's question about substance use and people having these overdoses on opiates. Like, you know, and we're not technically allowed to count those. And then I think the other thing, to be honest with you, since we're all family here, is anybody, how accurate the attempt and the suicide death rates data is even questionable, because we don't have standard ways of measuring that. So in some communities you have a coroner, and in some communities anybody can be a coroner. I tell people my daughter could be a coroner, you know, and other jurisdictions have medical examiners who go to school for this. So what if you're in a rural community, small, close-knit community where there's higher stigma associated with suicide, it might be very clear at the scene that this is a suicide death, and yet, you know, the coroner sits in church with you, and they know that they don't want to, quote unquote, embarrass your family, or they really feel like your family can't deal with that, having that label placed on their child. They might not classify it that way.
So Dr. Maxey, let me interrupt and just put a little bit more meat on that great bone of a question that you asked. Between suicide ideation and the suicide attempt is a whole lot of meat and sauce that has to do with, not only do I think about dying, but I think about committing suicide, and I think about committing suicide by jumping off that bridge near my house. And I walk past that bridge every day, and I think about jumping off. And even if I don't have to go that way, I walk by that bridge and I stand there for a long time, and I look down at the traffic I'm going to jump into. And then I lean over the bridge sometimes and imagine what it's going to be like, but I haven't jumped off yet. So there's no suicide attempt yet, but there's a lot of roadway between those thoughts and that attempt. And I think what Dr. Mahler is helping us with is understanding that we can jump in anywhere along the way. Anywhere along the way is an opportunity. I think, Dr. Mahler, that was your slide with the bridge and the water and the waterfall, right, if I'm not correct. Okay.
And also you bring it up in a good, so what Dr. Walks is talking about is intent. And the one of the scary things about young people that's not as typically characteristic of older people is that their attempts tend to be more impulsive, and particularly for Black youth. So the time between thinking and engaging in some behavior tends to be shorter. And that's scary for us because we realize it's harder to intervene when someone's being impulsive. Then back to Dr. Lawson's comment, when you're intoxicated under substances, that makes it even worse because your impulsivity is not, your thinking and your problem solving skills are compromised when you're intoxicated. So we have to think about all of that. I think the other issue for us is there are many kids who attempt suicide using we look at the method, like over-the-counter medications, who never get identified. And I've had my own patients have done this, where there have been multiple attempts. By the time we actually get an attempt that's been medically addressed, there may have been 4 or 5 attempts before that, that never reached the level where they got medical attention.
Yeah. Right before we go to Dr. Nabors-Stephens, I'm going to ask a question, but I don't necessarily expect an answer. But many of our people love soul food, and they eat pork and other unhealthy things every day. Is that a conscious deal to try to commit suicide by nutrition? But we'll go to Dr. Nabors-Stephens.
So, as I said in my other question, this is a really hot topic in pediatrics right now. But something that I have not heard anybody address. Now, clearly, if the child is expressing or thinking of harming themselves, they have made a transition. But in childhood development, there is and it varies from child to child, and that's really the question I'm coming to. There is a point that a child actually is able to understand the concept of their personal mortality.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, are you seeing a shift earlier because of what's going on in our lives, our world, or whatever in this internalization and realization of personal mortality?
We're not necessarily seeing a shift in their ability to conceptualize that a suicide attempt can lead to death and that death is final, but we do see a shift with more younger children attempting suicide, yes. Now, what we don't know is, does that mean their understanding of their own mortality has develops earlier? We don't have data that says that.
Yeah, that's why I asked the question, because we're seeing so much suicide in younger kids where you wouldn't even expect them to have made that transition of understanding their personal mortality.
It's a really great question. I think part of the problem is that even though the rates have increased with kids age 5 through 12, that's still a really small number. And so you almost need to do qualitative studies for that, because the N is very small. So even if you say it's increased 50%, the N is still very small.
Well, Doctor, we certainly appreciate you giving your valuable time to the Black Health Trust today, and hopefully in a short while in the future, you might come back and join us again. I'd
I'd
like
love
to
to.
ask you for any final comments before we go to our moderators. Any final comments you'd like to leave us with?
Just
Dr.
thank you for.
Dr. Maxey, and I'm sorry, Pastor Dr. Malik, Dr. Joshua raised his hand and had another comment, and then if we can go back to final comments, Dr. Maxey.
Okay, Dr. Joshua has a brief statement.
Yeah, thank you. So we have to remember, the human brain is mostly unconscious before 0 to 10. So children, so they did experiment. They found that when they take the brainwave, put EEG in kids' brain, it's the same brain waves with people who have hypnosis. So question I'm answering you, between 0 to 10, our brains is suspended animation. And yet we're forming habits and behaviors. We have to understand that. We have to, in the brain, the environment has changed, and we have different stressors, and kids need to have new coping strategies. So that's what I wanted to answer. It's not, we don't remember that. Until 11 to 12, that's why Piaget is not dead. The brain started becoming conscious. The consciousness of the mind, 10% of it started being conscious until around 11, 12.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the brain's forming habits and behaviors way before that. We have to know that if we're going to change the life of Black community. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Malik, final comments?
Just thank you for the invitation. I think, but my final comment would be that as important as it is to do crisis intervention, to really think about primary prevention. Let's get this problem solved way before kids are symptomatic. And so having programs like Haven helps, because anybody can participate in Haven. You don't have to be at risk. You don't have to have any problems. In fact, we talk to people about these 4 cores or these protective factors help to prevent problems. So we have to kind of shift our paradigm a little bit, and to be open to not doing just crisis intervention, but doing primary prevention as well.
Well, thank you so much, so much. Dr. Walks?
So Dr. Maxey, you know that I am prone to quoting many of our amazing philosophers in the United States of America. Before I quote the great American philosopher Ice Cube, I just want to say, Dr. Malik, how impressed I am with again the work that you're doing and how you're taking your science into the places where people are. And to quote Ice Cube, I can't quote the whole song just because it's inappropriate, but the first part, he says, woke up this morning, had to thank God, and mama cooked the breakfast with no hog. So that speaks to wherever we look in our culture, if we're willing to look, we see an acknowledgement of a good day, which is the name of that song, being connected to acknowledgement of that higher power in our lives, and healthy eating. So to your point about people eating right, I refer you to the great philosopher Ice Cube, Dr. Maxey.
Thank you. I'm going to look that up and refer to it. Thank you, sir. Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stevens.
Well, again, thank you so much for bringing your experience and wisdom to us this afternoon. You have left us with a lot to think about, but I am encouraged and heartened that all is not lost.
Yeah.
But we need to work on it. And you have given us a pathway. And for that, I am very thankful.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for spending your time with me this afternoon. Take care and God bless.
And thank you. I want to remind everybody that they need to be involved with what's going on in the world of voting and make sure that you vote for the person of your choice. And I'm suggesting it might be a female coming up. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody. Enjoy yourself.
Bye.
Good day, everyone.